Good afternoon again, or sorry, good morning to you all. I'm so honored to be with you today and spend some time wrestling with the question, how do we achieve housing and racial justice? Through reform, transformation, reimagination, or do we need to join others in the fight for abolition? If we want to achieve housing justice, it is so important to understand how we got here. And that starts with recognizing that the history of this country began with taking land that was not ours. Wherever you are, I encourage you to go to nativeland.ca and enter your location. I'm in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC, on the ancestral land of the Montauk tribe. At another land recognition at a conference, when we used to do those in person in before times, a native elder said, many of our ancestors have died waiting for people to seek their knowledge. This has stuck with me, and I think pertains uniquely to our work in housing. Does that happen in our communities? Have the people closest to the problem, who are closest to the solution, died waiting for us in power to seek their wisdom and truly end homelessness and housing poverty? Do they know better than us as gatekeepers what would make their community vibrant and safe? Think about that in our time together today. So a little bit about me and my organization. Yes, I'm the CEO of Funders Together to End Homelessness. We are a national network of over 260 funders from across the country that has for the last 5 years moved from centering racial equity to leading with racial and housing justice, because we know centering is still oriented to our point of view, a viewpoint often void of the knowledge of people with lived experience and expertise. At Funders Together, we are every day wrestling with the question, what does it look like to develop anti-racist policies and grant making and government? How do we be more pro-Black, pro-Indigenous, pro-LGBTQ? But I am first and always a Black woman, an immigrant, a child of immigrants, and that has shaped every part of my life. I am not just an advocate, I am disruptor of the status quo. If you could show up as your true authentic self in your work and your life, what would your title be? Do the people you work with, your colleagues, the folks that experience homelessness, get to show up as their true authentic selves? The one thing that has authentically shaped my life more than anything is my faith. I'm a Christian, a radical lover of Jesus, who believes that Jesus would have been on the side of justice and liberation from the systems of oppression. I'm a Christian that does not operate in a space of tolerance, but in inclusion and love. So over the last years, our country grappled with the pandemic, the overdue awakening to racism, and the rightful uprising in response to over 400 years of oppression. I started to ask myself, not what would Jesus do? What am I doing that does not represent the radical love of Jesus? So you might assume because I am a Black woman who works daily on racial justice, that I live a life that is woke. But the reality is uprooting the dominant culture in myself, the internalized racism in myself, and understanding what we mean when we say equity versus justice takes daily work, friends. It, for me, is like working out. When I really do it, I feel the pain from the weights and the movements that stretch me, and that's when I know I'm making progress. And in a moment of awakening myself, an uprising happened in me. I realized that my atheist, agnostic, Jewish, and Muslim friends and colleagues who were preaching the gospel of abolition made me a better Christian. I want to give you a little insight into that journey, as I hope you leave here today with more questions than answers, and your own uprising in your soul and your constitution, the type of awakening that leaves you questioning the status quo and gets to the radical reimagining of how we work towards ending homelessness through racial and housing justice. I actually usually end every presentation with this quote, but I thought we would start here today because we often come to these conferences eager for low-hanging fruit, wanting a toolkit, asking how to move fast through the pain of our racialized history that got us here and get to the results we want to see. But the reality is there's no low-hanging fruit. This quote is from a colleague and friend, Aisha Alexander Young, who's actually now the CEO of Black Giving Back. But at the time when she was interviewing at the Meyer Foundation in DC to be their chief equity officer, the staff at the Meyer Foundation, who had also spent years deeply trying to figure out racial equity and racial justice, asked her, where would you start? What is the low-hanging fruit? And she reminded them, there is no low-hanging fruit, friends. The tree is 400 years old and the roots are deep. These trees are deeply rooted in racism and the fruit they bear is rotten. We have to plant new seeds and toil new soil. And so I hope you think about that in our time together today as well. How are you planting new seeds in a new environment with new soil? But now to ground ourselves in some truths. Many of you might have heard these truths before, but I believe we model the work of uprooting white supremacy and oppression and leading with racial equity and justice by starting on the same page and doing it every time we start to have these discussions. We know better than a lot of other work that despite the rhetoric, COVID-19 was not a great equalizer. In fact, it has only exacerbated structural inequities that already exist. Black, Native American, and Latinx communities have been impacted by this virus at disproportionate rates. The disparities we are seeing are rooted in structural racism, though, and are not about race. I remind folks every time, there is nothing wrong with me as a Black woman or my friends and family in the Latinx and Indigenous communities. The issue is structural racism. This is not about pre-existing conditions. It is not about pre-existing inequities. It is about pre-existing inequities from stolen Indigenous land and chattel slavery. As Race Forward reminds us, COVID-19 kills, structural racism is its accomplice. As many of us heard the words of Eric Garner in the last words of George Floyd, I can't breathe. We know that suffocation and oppression is not confined to police brutality. Racism, my friends, is taking every opportunity from us to feel like we can breathe without oppression in our housing, education, health, and criminal legal system. The public lynching of Black men takes our breath away, and the constant structural racism is killing us slowly, leaving us gasping for air as we all call out for real change through anti-racist policies. And what makes it hard to catch our breath, folks, is we know the system is not broken. It was designed by white supremacist slave owners on stolen Indigenous land to protect their interest. It is working just as it was designed. So when the verdict of Derek Chauvin was announced and folks called it justice, I bristled. That was not justice. Justice would mean George Floyd was still alive. And so the question we must ask ourselves is, what does housing justice mean for our work and movement? Is justice about ending someone's homelessness, or is justice about fundamentally changing the conditions that lead to the trauma of homelessness and housing insecurity? I believe that if we are not working every day to go beyond reform and to start to think about transformation, reimagining and abolishing systems that lead to homelessness and housing insecurity, we, my friends, are complicit in the trauma. We might end someone's homelessness, but we have not done anything to change the conditions that cause homelessness to happen, nor, I would argue, are we doing anything to ensure that folks have agency and power over where and how they live after they have experienced homelessness. We know these truths, friends. Black people comprise 13% of the general population in the United States and 26% of those living in poverty, but they account for more than 40% of the homeless population. So poverty rates alone do not explain the overrepresentation. The proportion of Black and American Indian and Alaska Native individuals experiencing homelessness exceeds their proportion of those living in poverty. 7% of youth in the United States are LGBTQ, while 40% of youth experiencing homelessness are LGBTQ. LGBTQ young people are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than non-LGBTQ youth. Youth who are Black and LGBTQ reported the highest rates of homelessness at 16%, compared to white LGBTQ youth at 8%. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, only 6% of white households are extremely low income renters. Black households account for 12% of all households in the United States and 19% of all renters. But they account for 26% of all renter households with extremely low incomes. And we see the same for our Latinx friends. 12% of the households, 19% of rental households, 21% of all rental households with extremely low incomes. And the reality is it's not that different in Minnesota. Thanks to my colleague and friend Kathy for sharing this slide with me and waking me up and reminding me that Native Americans in Minnesota are 22 more times likely to be homeless compared to white non-Hispanic Minnesotans, and 24 more times more likely to be unsheltered. I remind you these truths, friends, because we can no longer talk about homelessness in relation to just poverty and economics. We must be explicit in naming that homelessness and housing insecurity is deeply connected to structural racism, redlining, and the defunding of public housing when it started to serve more people that look like me than white working class. I remind you these truths because we are hearing local leaders talking about cracking down on people experiencing homelessness and therefore criminalizing it. We in the movement are asking why a crackdown and not evidence-based solutions, but we know incarceration and criminalization is our national response to the issues that have a disproportionate impact on people of color. Homelessness in America is the product of structural racism. Black people are forced into homelessness more frequently because they were barred from building generational wealth, because America has criminalized their existence, because opportunity in this country has never been equal. If we resort to talking about the challenge in colorblind ways, we will not identify specific and targeted solutions for those who need them most. Instead, we will continue to recycle the same solutions that work well for some and not at all for others. Without an initial focus on racial equity, then leading to with housing and racial justice, we won't interrupt the historical, institutionalized, and implicit biases and policies and practices that lead to persistent and pervasive disproportionalities we see in all of our systems. But what do we mean when we say racial equity, racial justice, and housing justice? Racial equity means closing the gaps so that race does not predict one's success, while also improving outcomes for all. Equity is distinct from equality in that it aspires to achieve fair outcomes and considers history and implicit bias. Rather than simply providing equal opportunity for everyone, racial equity is not just the absence of overt racial discrimination, it is also the presence of deliberate policies and practices that provide everyone with the support they need to improve the quality of their lives. Racial equity is rooted in eliminating disparities, and racial justice is creating power and a culture of abundance. And we have to know the difference if we are going to achieve housing justice. Our colleagues at the Philanthropic Institute for Racial Equity remind us a racial equity lens separates symptoms from causes, but a racial justice lens brings into view the confrontation of power, the redistribution of resources, and the systemic transformation necessary for real change. Justice requires urgent, fundamental changes that reposition communities of color in relation to power and resources, which includes being able to challenge and shape the many institutions that determine a community's condition. It's not about achieving parity in our housing outcomes, folks, for those who are disproportionately experience housing insecurity and homelessness. It's about repairing the results of structural racism and giving power to those historically marginalized and disenfranchised from the system that caused them harm. We, all of us, often water down the reality of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, Native erasure, and systemic racism. And we like to go to these comfortable spaces of diversity and equity and inclusion, mistaking equality for equity, thinking that if programs or policies serve people who are Black or brown, that they will achieve racial equity or justice through more programs and resources. To be anti-racist, folks, we have to hold the true tenets of, yes, critical race theory, or what I just call the history of this country, and understand the racialized history that got us here and work to change those structures, not just add more money to the problem and contribute to what I call the layer cake of racism, where we put seemingly good policies and resources on top of structures that were designed to oppress Black and Indigenous people, resulting in just really bad cake. Racial equity is the path to justice and liberation. It is a tool to get there. It is not the endpoint. So I shared with you that 5 years ago, Funders Together started wrestling with racial equity, and we had more questions than we had answers. And if we started to unpack the internalized oppression in ourselves, we confronted the reality that philanthropy has enabled and been complicit in the injustices of this world as they have gained their wealth on the backs of stolen land and chattel slavery, and that equity is not enough. So in the last 18 months, as all of us have wrestled, we have also wrestled with the idea of what is housing justice. We offer this to you, and it's an offer and a point of discussion. But at Funders Together to End Homelessness, we believe housing is a fundamental human right. Housing justice is a building block for racial justice and liberation. A just housing society offers the assurance of safe, accessible, secure, affordable, and dignified living conditions where there is equitable access to what one needs for a quality of life lived on one's own terms. Housing justice recognizes that for generations, such housing has been denied to Black people and Indigenous people and other communities of color, which has fueled the disproportionate numbers of Black and Indigenous people and other people of color experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity today. By pursuing housing justice, we are unapologetically stating that homelessness and housing insecurity is a racialized experience exasperated by the forces of structural racism, and corrective action needs to take place to address the cumulative disparities. And systems of accountability need to be present to ensure housing for all. But as my pastor says, let me make it plain, folks. Housing justice is not moving folks to the next most affordable place, void of their community and what folks need to make them feel safe, to make them feel that it's not just a house, but a home. Housing justice dismantles the idea that proximity to whiteness is needed in order for our community to be thriving. Housing justice will test white people's declaration that Black lives matter. So we need to talk about how to get there. And that starts with power and being a gatekeeper. We can understand racial equity and how that is a path to racial justice. We can ground ourselves in the need for housing justice, not just more affordable housing, but the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. And we have to confront the reality that the housing movement has just been putting window dressing on the master's house. We are seeking to start to transform and eventually move past our good intentions and dismantle the very systems designed to oppress and suppress. Transformation is not just a transform or different outcome. It means transforming the process in the way we make decisions and prioritize resources, if we need to prioritize them at all, because a justice society is an abundant society where we don't have to make those decisions because everyone gets what they need. It's, my friends, the literal transformation of power. It forces you to ask, all of us, how are we giving up power to Black and brown folks, especially people with lived expertise? I believe that transformation starts with us understanding the role we all play as gatekeepers. We are all gatekeepers to the resources communities need to have agency and power over their own housing. Philanthropy are gatekeepers to money, and in turn, nonprofits and governments become gatekeepers to that same money through our program implementation and resource allocation. As policy advocates, we are gatekeepers in the form of access to policy decisions or policy makers. In order to achieve racial and housing justice, we have to liberate and decolonize our role as gatekeepers. And that starts by giving up power. Are we bringing people to the tables of decision-making with a folding chair or a permanent chair? When do we get to the point, friends, where we are not asking folks to come to our table of power and decision-making, but they get to create their own tables or circles or whatever they like that are powerful in their own right? So no, this does not mean that you have a consumer advisory council or people with lived experience on your board. That is not enough. It does not mean defining our success by proximity to whiteness. Our partner in Black Liberation, Jonathan Likes, frames transformation as this: when we take power away from oppressive systems, bring many people with lived expertise to question those systems, push the edge of what is considered possible, shift political debate to include more radical possibilities. One of the radical possibilities I have been wrestling with is abolition. For me, abolition means just that. We abolish the current systems and reimagine with people with lived expertise, new systems, structures, and ways to build community. So how does the work of abolition make me a better Christian, a better leader, a better co-conspirator for justice? It came to me in this moment, friends. Over a series of conversations with people with lived expertise and me just listening to people who've been harmed by many of our systems, criminal, foster care, healthcare, housing. And several young folks with more fire in their belly said to me, we can't call for the people who murdered George Floyd and Breonna Taylor to be arrested. That is not abolition. That is revenge. Goodness gracious, folks, that was it for me. The systems that have caused harm cannot repair harm. Love, grace, empathy is not carried out by perpetuating harm. It only comes in the radical reimagining of this constant experiment in the possibility of America. So we recognize we are all gatekeepers. We start thinking about sharing up and giving up power. And I know many of you, either last summer or years before, when injustice would hold our attention on our phones or on the TV with the killing of Black men and women, would say, Black Lives Matter. And you would do the work of allyship. But I am here to tell some more truths, and that allyship is not enough. It is time for all of us to put something on the line as co-conspirators. So you ask, what is a co-conspirator? And if I'm already an ally, why do I need to transition to a co-conspirator? To put it simply, being an ally is lazy. While yes, it is great that white people and people in power, gatekeepers, are willing to give their support to people of color, we need more. This is where the term co-conspirator comes into play. By definition, a co-conspirator is a person who is engaged in a conspiracy with another. To be a white co-conspirator means to deliberately acknowledge that people of color are criminalized for dismantling white supremacy. It means we choose to take on the consequences of participating in a criminalized act, and we choose to support and center people of color in the movement for housing justice. And the question I often get asked, folks, is, do I have hope that we can get there? I have to be honest with you and say that I've not had hope for a long time. I've struggled to find joy. There are days when hope and despair live in the same place, but I'm gaining back my hope. I am realizing that joy is the resistance to the oppression we face. So I do have hope. I have hope because the boldness and the conviction from the housing justice movement to not tinker around the edges or accept incremental change, but fundamentally uproot the oppression in our system gives me hope. I have hope, friends, because we have finally moved from talking about racial equity to pushing for racial and housing justice and knowing the difference. Housing justice and racial justice seeks to transform the way we work by giving people who have been historically marginalized agency and power over where they live and how they live, and that gives me hope. I have hope because the energy on the streets is finally speaking louder than the people who are gatekeepers to resources and power. I have hope, folks, because we are finally listening to what communities are saying will make them feel safe, and we know we can't end housing insecurity and homelessness until we defund and dismantle the systems designed for our oppression. I have hope because we are realizing that justice does not look like people filling out a ton of forms or going through the many hoops of our nonprofit industrial complexes to get to the resources they need for their basic rights. I have hope because some of us are finally saying we should just trust people and dismantle the systems that further oppress folks during times of trauma. I have hope because power in the work is finally shifting to where it rightfully belongs, to the people closest to the problem. So my question for you today, friends, is will you join me and others in the journey of abolition on the journey of hope? Will you shift from learning about racial equity to action that leads to justice? Are you ready to decolonize our systems of oppression and gatekeeping? Will you give up power to Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Are you ready, friends, for a radical reimagining of our community that will push us towards racial and housing justice? Will you not sit on the sidelines as an ally, but be a co-conspirator, a comrade in our shared liberation? Will you remember the words of Son Renee Taylor, an author and a visionary who shared her own lived experience with homelessness? We cannot go back to normal, friends. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal other than it normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all humanity and nature. I invite you to join with me and us on this movement for justice and liberation. It is time to plant new seeds and toil new soil and stitch the garment and do the work that will get us all free. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Amanda. That was you gave us a lot, I think, to think about. And I'm thinking about my own privilege in occupying, being a white woman, leading an organization. And I think I'm constantly thinking about that and what that looks like for our organization. And I'm sure other leaders and people across who are listening today have been thinking about that too. So we have some questions rolling in. And so the first one is really about you and your experience as a leader. You know, there are so many important pieces in advocacy work and the interconnected systems that impact homelessness. What drew you specifically to use your power and leadership in philanthropy?
That's such a good question. And I think the how we got here story is really important because it starts to like stitch that new garment and recognize people as unique beings. So it's probably a question we should ask everyone at the start of meetings, like, how did you get here? How did you get to this place and who sent you? So I would say who sent me are Jimmy and Marcia and Deary. They were immigrants to this country. They are my parents. And they came from a pretty privileged background in their home countries of Jamaica and Kenya. And when they got to this country during the end of the civil rights movement, they had no home. They had a house, but no home. They quite didn't know how to fit in with the Black community, and they weren't accepted, obviously, by the white community, and were just languishing until some people mentored and adopted them and brought them home. And so growing up, even in our economic privilege, they reminded me that you can't do anything alone, that people had looked and cared after them, and it was my responsibility to carry that on. And so from a very early age, I started to see injustices in my community, whether it was the kids that I went to school with in a pretty rich county right outside of DC, who did not have food to eat, who I knew were experiencing housing insecurity. And that started to move me to say, like, we can't live in a community where this is true, right? And so that is what started my work in housing and homelessness, but specifically philanthropy. That's another story for another time, but I'll say that like many people, like, fall into certain sectors of a bigger movement and their work. And philanthropy is this odd place for me where we can start to disrupt. We can name things that haven't been named. And I believe the root of disrupting all of our oppression is actually disrupting how philanthropy works in general, and being able to dismantle their very existence and turn over power and resources. That's not what I thought when I came into this job, but it's where I am squarely now, and the work that I hope to do every day. If I'm not waking up saying or doing things that can get me fired, I'm not doing the work.
I love that answer as someone who is in development myself. And that actually leads us really nicely into our next question, which is that knowing that philanthropy has traditionally been used as a way to hoard power, hoard wealth, what does it look like when it's not rooted in this scarcity mindset? And what does Funders Together to End Homelessness do differently?
Well, hopefully we won't exist if we really uproot it. And if we do exist in some iteration, it won't be led by me. It should be led by people with lived expertise, people of color with lived expertise. So that could be an interim step, but the long-term step, and I'll show this to you because I keep this sticky note on my desk. I had a meeting, I don't know if you all can see it, but I'll read it for you. I had a meeting with a funder who said, we should just turn over our $1 trillion in wealth in philanthropy and turn it over to make it feel like reparations. And I keep this on my desk to remind me that that is my job, right? Is to make sure that the dismantling of philanthropy as we know it, and not just private philanthropy, but even the way our government resources, has to feel like reparations. It has to repair harm, but it also has to do justice. And so that means that we don't ask people their theory of change or outcomes when we're talking about a grant application, because we have designed systems that just give people what they need. And if they need philanthropy, it is not for their basic needs. You know, that's the flipping part of it. We have thought of philanthropy for a long time to meet basic needs, to fill gaps. But we are owed something different in this country. And philanthropy needs to be a way that we rightfully gain back the power we have lost because of oppression.
Speaking of disrupting systems, brings me to kind of a follow-up question that builds on that, but racism is so deeply intertwined with every system in our country. What do you believe are the first steps that we need to take as a nation to disrupt them all?
So long before the questions or debate about critical race theory were a thing, if you've heard me speak, I've said, like, we need to slow down and understand the racialized history of our country. How can we disrupt and dismantle something that we don't even understand? So I think I've been on that journey. I think we all are on that journey, hopefully. The starting point is recognizing how we got here. recognizing the harm that has been done, especially to our Indigenous family, when we think about when we think about the history, and not just history, when we understand that purposely our government was set up and wrote documents that tried to destroy a group of people, and how that is translated over time to how our systems work. We have to start there before we can get to anywhere else. And now I'm forgetting some of your question. Your question was around disrupting systems, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and so, the question was like, what are the first steps?
Yeah.
So you talked about like acknowledging our history,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, so it's acknowledging our history. It is examining everything we do from the lens of disruption and understanding that most of what we do doesn't make sense except for the folks in our dominant culture and power, right? And so when we start to ask ourselves things like, why do we have these rules in, for instance, our shelter systems, or why do we set up our resource allocation to make people jump through hoops? We understand that a lot of it is because we fundamentally don't trust people, especially the idea of Black women, poor Black women. And that makes us start to think about how we do things differently. If we understand how we got there, how that has implications for today, we start to examine things from that lens. We start to reimagine with people with lived expertise. I mean, those are the starting points. And it's a constant disruption. As a staff at Funders Together to End Homelessness, we hold up virtually or on paper for some, like the characteristics of white dominant culture and the alternatives. So even in every staff meeting, in every conversation that we have, we are recognizing where we are holding on to it, enabling it, and how to disrupt it. As we started to move into a justice-oriented space, we start to question like the things that we do. Is that pro-Black? Does it make people feel like they can show up as themselves? So it's the internal, external disruption just starts by literally doing it every day and making sure that we are questioning ourselves. And we may not have all the answers, but we have to start questioning ourselves.
That's great. And I know you already talked a little bit about some of the challenges you promote on your team, showing up every single day to do this work, working yourselves out of a job eventually. But what are some challenges that you would pose to those in this virtual room today who might be decision or policymakers, nonprofit leaders, politicians, who are upholding systems of oppression and gatekeeping resources on a daily basis? What are some challenges you might pose to people in the room today?
When I did some organizing in community, and we would have these partnership meetings with government and nonprofits, my rule was we wouldn't start the meeting until we had people who represented the people who we are actually talking about. And it made a lot of people mad and frustrated at me. But my challenge to you is again, and this is not just creating a space where we bring people to a table with a folding chair, but every decision that you make should be in collaboration, true, authentic collaboration with people with lived expertise. And every decision you make should be questioning how are these resources being allocated? Are we designing a system that feels like trust? And am I setting myself to give up power to people? And so that's my challenge to you today, is to who's in the room, who actually has power? Are we creating more oppressive systems? Are we trying to challenge folks in those oppressive systems as to why? Like, are we just asking the questions why? And, you know, how are you working yourself out of a job? Is that your goal? Or is your goal to hold on to that power? And that's what I would challenge with you today.
Thank you. I love that. And it kind of brings me around to kind of a related question, kind of back to your work. You called yourself a disruptor. I mean, you have years of knowledge and experience, wisdom to share and impart with on us today. But why did you choose the title of disruptor? And what do you wish you would have known when you first started as a disruptor?
Yeah, I think the question I would like to ask is what I would have known when I started as an executive director first. We sometimes as leaders, we often get the question like, what keeps us up at night? And I think the only thing that keeps me up at night now, besides like, how are we going to change the world? And when we do change the world, how will we make it so everyone can have rhythm and dance? That's an aside, because I believe in joy and having fun. So like, those are the things that keep me up at night. But the reality is what keeps me up at night is thinking about back to my days first being an executive director. And I did not intend to do harm, but I did harm because I did not think about disrupting in a way that understood racial justice and housing justice. And so I wish I would have known that it was possible. I wish I would have known that I did not have to play into the dominant culture of this society and try to assimilate. And as a young leader, as a Black woman, I wish I would have known that disruption is a place of boldness. It can be a scary place, but it's the only thing that will keep you from sitting up at night and wondering, did I cause anyone harm? Because I didn't try to disrupt what was oppressing them. And I was so scared and trapped in my own mess. I mean, I took my first executive director job and I was not even 30. So I had a lot of stuff to unpack. And in that unpacking that, I didn't set out to do harm, but I did harm because I wasn't disrupting the system. And so I wish I would have known that I could.
And similar to along that same vein of wishing you had known you could, being on, the receiving end of a lot of emotional things you had to work through. And we just have 2 short questions left, but what's the biggest piece of wisdom you can give to your BIPOC siblings, comrades, what have you, trying to navigate a space that can often feel stacked against them?
So I'll answer that question and add a bonus answer to that, because I have a message for our white colleagues and partners and friends. One, I just want to say to the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, I see you, I hear you, I am here for you. Please make sure I or others can be your soft place to land. This work of dismantling systems and housing and racial justice will be harder on us than anyone else, because we will every day be witness to people realizing the harm that this country has done to us, be witness to their fragility, and be witness to their lack of fire in their belly for disruption. But we can get through it, not because we are resilient. I reject the premise that we build systems that make people resilient, but we will get through it because we will rest as part of the revolution. We will get through it because we will find joy in the resistance to the oppression we face, and we will get through it because we will do it together. And for the white folks in the room, I hope you hold dear the trauma that comes with this work, the silence that has been carrying for a long time in the souls of Black people and Indigenous people and people of color, that we don't get to turn it off when we shut down our computer, that as we work within our systems of oppression, that we have to keep our family safe, and that causes us to be up at night. And so ask yourselves, white leaders, how are you co-creating a space that recognizes that trauma, that doesn't continue to do harm, that lets people have joy even in hard spaces, and that contributes to the reimagining of where we can be?
So we are now at our final question of the Q&A portion, and I just want to thank you for just all the insights that you provided today, the challenging questions that I think we all need to hear these things. I think especially as white allies who want to become even bigger disruptors in the system and how we receive this information and process it. But the final question that I had from the audience was, many of the attendees are wanting to know how to join you in this work. Is there a recommendation that you have for them?
My recommendation is start by listening to the people in your community that you don't hear often. By joining me, you start to joining others who are working towards housing and racial justice, starts by co-creating those spaces that I talked about. If you're not starting to listen and truly understand and disrupt in your backyard, then we can't have a national movement around racial and housing justice. But practically, I would say I am happy to also send these links. I'm part of a coalition, the National Coalition for Housing Justice, which is comprised of many of the national leaders who are working to think about policy in a different way to achieve racial and housing justice. There are many friends and colleagues in this work who are thinking about liberation and disruption, and I'm happy to share those resources. But you will not only join me, but honor me and the struggle and the work by just starting to listen to people in your community about what they really need and what will make them feel safe.
Thank you. We'll be sure when we send more information out next week that we'll follow up and provide those resources to folks too, as a follow-up to the conference, along with the recording of the session. So if they want to go back and reference any of the information that you shared, I think that'll be really helpful. So thank you so much. That felt like it was both energizing and it provided so much information to think about. So, you know, as we close up this portion, I just want to thank you again, Amanda, for coming into the space with us and challenging us and sharing your insights with us. I think this was just an incredible keynote presentation in this space that we're sort of living in the virtual world and trying to return to normal, but it's not normal. It's not normal at all.
Yep. Well, I thank you as a leader for holding space for these conversations. And I just want to share how important that is. Over this past week, I've been asked to speak at many different spaces. And for the first time, someone tried to censor me and said that my truths were too much for their white conservative audience. And so it takes a lot of courage as a white leader to say that no matter if people are going to be uncomfortable, no matter if it's going to challenge us, we need to have these conversations. So I thank you for the invitation. I thank all of you. I know I have some friends in the virtual audience for being here and just wrestling with these hard conversations and truths. Rest, it is part of the revolution. Find joy, it is the resistance to the oppression we face. Take good care of yourselves. We cannot do this work of justice and liberation if we're not good to ourselves. Be good to yourselves, folks.
Thank you, Amanda.